And that concludes portfolio questions, and we'll now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6933 in the name of Derek Mackay on progress towards National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press their request to speak buttons now, and I would call on Minister Derek Mackay to speak to and move the motion in his name when he is ready. And if as soon as you are ready, Mr Mackay, you have 14 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate is about the Scottish Government's two key planning policy documents, the National Planning Framework, a long-term spatial plan for the development of Scotland, and Scottish Planning Policy, which sets out what we want the planning system to deliver at the strategic and local levels. I'd like to highlight some of the key aspects of our proposals and touch upon the extensive consultation process we're currently engaged in, of which this debate is a key part. Firstly, however, I want to set these policies in the wider context of planning reform. The central purpose of the Scottish Government is to make Scotland a more successful country, with opportunities for all to flourish through increasing sustainable economic growth. Planning can and must do more to contribute to this. I want the planning system, more now than ever, to focus on delivering jobs and growth. I want it to facilitate the investment in infrastructure, which will be crucial as we make the transition to a genuinely low-carbon economy. And I want the outcome of the planning process to be better places, places which are better for us, which are more sustainable and which attract investment. But it's only through, of course...
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and it's very, very clear what he wants, that he wants growth to be the central purpose of the planning system. But doesn't the legislation that was passed in Session 2 of this Parliament suggest that a different objective, sustainable development, should be the criterion that ministers have in mind at all times in relation to their decisions in regard to the planning system?
Minister.
I'm sure that Mr Harvey will be relieved to hear that we have protection of the environment, and indeed greater protection of the environment at our core, at the same time as encouraging sustainable economic growth. I think it's for those reasons he can have the certainty that we're very mindful of our obligations. But it is only through a well-functioning planning system, efficient, inclusive, focused on delivering high-quality development. It is only through this can we realise these ambitious plans. I want therefore to briefly outline the next steps I've identified for our planning reform. Firstly, I want to underline our commitment in Scotland to a plan-led system, and I don't mean a slavish adherence to lines on a map at the expense of good judgment and common sense. But I do mean forward-looking, place-based, visionary development plans which clearly support growth and are produced on time. We need to focus on performance and resources. That's why we, with COSLA, have convened a high-level group to look at planning performance so we can work in partnership to improve it. I believe an adequately resourced planning system is a fair expectation if we are to have a high-quality service and continual improvement. And that's why in April, with Parliament's support, we increased by 20% the cost of planning fees. And that's why we introduced the e-planning system, which has been a great success, making the planning system more efficient, but also more inclusive, allowing online access to planning information across the country. 5 years since its launch, it is on track to deliver financial savings of £50 million during its first 10 years, all for an initial investment of some £11 million. Today, some 45% of all planning applications in Scotland are submitted through the e-planning website. This cuts both ways, though. An adequately resourced planning authority must deliver the level of service we all want to see. We're progressing this through the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. Margaret Mitchell has tabled an amendment which would have the Scottish planning policy underline the crucial role of enforcement in the planning system. In those cases where a failure to comply with planning requirements causes real problems for communities or risks serious environmental harm, then it is absolutely right that the planning authority has the power to take timely and effective action to remedy this. I'm therefore happy to accept the amendment in Margaret Mitchell's name. I'm also convinced that the ambitious policies and a well-performing planning system go hand in hand. That's why, throughout the spring and early summer, I've been leading an intensive engagement programme with all those with an interest in planning. I'm delivering a series of workshops for frontline planning staff around the country, focusing on our agenda of improved performance and culture change, and in support of our consultations for MPF3 and SPP. We're looking at holding a series of stakeholder events across Scotland, from Orkney to Edinburgh, from Dundee to Dumfries. I'll be visiting many of the national developments proposed in our main issues report. Let me turn now to Scottish planning policy and to its first comprehensive review. A recurring theme in our stakeholder engagement for the SPP was the view that for the most part it is serving us well, but I now want to make it much clearer about the specific outcomes we want planning to deliver. First and foremost, I want the SPP to be much clearer about how important it is that the planning system delivers jobs and growth. So development plans must be deliverable and informed by sound economic evidence, particularly the local economic strategy. And the economic benefits of a proposed development need to be a material consideration. Significant weight should be placed on economic benefits, on jobs in particular. I also intend bringing the key policy messages on placemaking into the heart of Scottish planning policy. And our proposed policy reflects the issues being covered in a review of town centres, which we'll be reporting shortly. In particular, we have widened the town centre's first approach so that not just retail and leisure developments, but others which generate significant travel, like schools, hospitals and offices, should be in the town centre wherever possible. You might think from recent press coverage the SPP and MPF3 are all about wind farms. That's far from the case, of course. But let me be absolutely clear. The Scottish Government's support for renewable energy, including onshore wind, remains as strong as ever. Alongside this, we want to see more community benefits from new wind farms and more community-owned developments. But we need to see the right developments in the right places. We're strengthening protection for our finest landscapes, including greater protection for wildland, and we do not want to see new wind farms in our national parks and national scenic areas, our most scenic and iconic landscapes. Of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful a second time. I wonder if the Minister could just specify precisely what this provision means, a presumption that there will be no wind farms within national parks or scenic landscape. Does that mean any individual wind turbine would be covered by that presumption, or what is defined by a wind farm?
Minister.
We're working on the exact definition of wind farms, but of course any reasonable person would understand it's a number of wind turbines in a particular location. But let me be clear, the policy on that Group 1 in terms of the national scenic areas and the national parks is, for the first time, an outright ban of wind farms in those particular locations. And that's what it means. And I'm happy to return to the member on specific wind turbines, but I say again that individual planning applications are determined on their merits. In terms of the renewables industry perspective, I've welcomed the engagement, and there will be ongoing engagement as we approach the 23rd of July, which is the end of this 12-week consultation exercise. But I am convinced that we can deliver on our renewables targets, providing greater opportunities and also greater protection where that's required. But the challenge of climate change compels us to make the transition to a sustainable, growing, low-carbon economy. And that's a key focus of our proposals in the third National Planning Framework. Sarah Boyack has tabled an amendment noting that climate change target for 2011 was missed and suggesting that policies and investment are required to cut emissions further. We quite agree. The Government's Climate Change RPP2 details a package of measures that can achieve our targets, and we've already committed more than £1.1 billion over the current spending review period, specifically for action on emissions. The amendment also highlights the importance of the planning system to sustainable development and the importance of sustainable communities in helping to achieve Scotland's climate change targets. We agree with that also. I'm pleased that Sarah Boyack appears to be so closely aligned with the Government on these matters, and I'm therefore happy to accept the amendment in her name. I've touched already on what we propose through Scottish planning policy for onshore wind energy, but our ambitions for low-carbon energy infrastructure amount to far more than that. Grid enhancement is essential if we're to make the most of our natural energy resources, and MPF2 identified a suite of electricity grid enhancements as a national development. We propose to retain this in MPF3, updated to take account of current plans, in particular for offshore and international connections. If we are to reap the maximum economic benefits of the low-carbon revolution, we must ensure that we have the necessary infrastructure and a welcoming environment for the design, manufacturing, installation and servicing of renewable energy generation here in Scotland. That's why we want to give support to some of our best opportunities to do so, our low-carbon enterprise areas, sites in the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan, and other clusters of energy-related activity in places like Aberdeenshire, Ayrshire and the 3 island authorities. As part of our balanced energy mix, we very much want to see the application of carbon capture and storage to gas and coal-fired power stations in Scotland, and we have a number of projects in Scotland where, with the right financial support, we can make this happen. The Peterhead Carbon Capture and Storage Project is an opportunity to develop the world's first commercial-scale, full-chain carbon dioxide capture, transportation and storage project, and has secured preferred bidder status by the UK Government Department for Energy and Climate Change. And proposals for a new power station with CCS at Grangemouth remain on the reserve list. Of course.
Johnson.
The Minister take this opportunity to clarify what the status of the Peterhead proposal would be should his party's policy of independence be successful.
Minister.
I'm sure that Scotland's excellent record on energy and on ambitious climate change targets will continue with independence. In fact, will be enhanced with independence. And any ongoing discussions with the UK Government, if they're mature and pragmatic and realistic, will benefit the position of Scotland as we reach the ambitions that we have laid out. And I don't buy into the idea that the UK Government would be so reckless on the idea that Scotland achieves independence. We see it very much as a pragmatic opportunity, and I'm sure the UK Government will see sense also. One thing that has been striking as I've talked to people about what should be in MPF3 has been the support for green infrastructure. And the Central Scotland Green Network has been a very popular national development from NPF2. There is no doubt, therefore, that we want to continue to support this. We've also had much interest in walking and cycling infrastructure, and I therefore propose that the development of a national network of long-distance routes for walking and cycling be a national development. Propose, of course.
Paddy Beamish.
Taking intervention. 20 years ago, I was involved in helping set up a community nature reserve in Clydesdale, which we call Loudon Pond, which was from site regeneration and is now regarded as a community asset for biodiversity. In relation to the policies on brownfield sites, could the Minister reflect on the importance of some brownfield sites for biodiversity and public green spaces, as highlighted by Bug Life and others?
Minister.
I think that's an excellent point, and I would agree, and I've been very impressed with work, for example, of the Scottish Wildlife Trust, who I visited in Cumbernauld, looking at the pathways connecting urban communities with the environmental aspect too, showing how we can connect ecosystems with economics. And the Central Scotland Green Network is a great example of where that's been done on a strategic basis, which is why I'm delighted to say that that is proposed to continue within National Planning Framework 3. And I think that very important point about that understanding of the environment is very much central in these documents, and we want to bring that alive locally as well as on a national basis. In terms of our proposed spatial strategy, of course we must recognise the role of our cities as drivers of economic growth, and we will do further work on both the cities and the towns, as I mentioned earlier, to support economic regeneration. And examples of good planning, which are supported through our proposals, also include for the first time as a national designation at Ravenscraig and Dundee waterfront, where we were able to launch the proposals. Further comments around the decarbonisation of the economy, on alternative fuels, on decarbonising transport, support of rail, of modal shifts, and further energy aspects as they relate to our low carbon ambitions. We've also taken cognizance of how some MPF2 projects have been developed and delivered, no longer require that consenting regime, and therefore they no longer feature in MPF3. Other changes will include the long-term ambitions at Scapa Flow and Hunterston, which others may talk of. So I believe that these policies represent something for every part of the country, focusing on sustainable economic growth whilst also giving greater protection to the environment, a balance that we have to strike for the right reasons to achieve the Government's overarching objective in consultation with communities across Scotland. And in that sense, I commend the motion and these policy documents to Parliament.
Many, many thanks. Now call on Sarah Byatt, up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I first of all want to thank the many organisations who sent us briefings today. I realise they would have had a very short time to pull together some of their key observations, and it's been really helpful, certainly to me, I suspect others, in preparing for today. At its heart, planning is a democratic process which enables communities and their representatives to shape change. And the purpose of the Labour amendments is to flag up our concerns about the increasing use of the term sustainable economic growth rather than sustainable development. We're concerned because a more sustainable Scotland will be created not just by willing it to happen, but by the many, many incremental day-to-day decisions taken through the planning system and by infrastructure development. And leadership's absolutely crucial, and there is much to welcome in both the draft NPF 3 and Scottish planning policy. But the definitions are important, and I want to take the opportunity today to push the Minister on the way that he has framed the purpose and the objectives in the NPF, because I believe that definitions are important, and the Minister's suggestion that economic benefit should trump other considerations would be a step backwards. There's been a healthy debate on this issue in discussions on the Better Regulation Bill. Third parties such as the Law Society of Scotland and Scottish Environment Link and Unison have flagged up their concerns about the fact that sustainable development has now been used throughout the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament, and its international status, EU status, UK status is in our own legislation, whereas the term sustainable economic growth potentially means all things to all people and could potentially justify short-term change that would have long-term negative impact. And I believe that by putting sustainable economic growth above sustainable development in the Scottish planning policy document, it's the wrong way round. I accept, as the Minister said, that we're currently in a recession and we're experiencing a severe economic downturn. So I understand the ambition to ensure that both the NPF 3 and Scottish planning policy contribute to economic recovery. It's absolutely essential. But we need to make sure that we take a long-term perspective too. And if we are to deliver the sustainable low-carbon Scotland referred to in the Scottish Government motion, that means that ensuring all development contributes to both the social and environmental objectives encompassed by sustainable development alongside our economic objectives. So that's why we flagged up that we're still not on the right trajectory to deliver either our short or our long-term commitments on climate change. And if we're being honest, we all know that some of the gains made so far, the big gains on climate emissions, have actually been as a result of economic change and recession. And we need to make sure that as we come out of recession, we do so without sacrificing those gains and leaving future generations with even harder challenges. And planning is fundamental to delivering that, to delivering a vision of sustainable Scotland. NPF 3 enables national priorities to be established, which can then be the basis of public and private investment. So it should be a long-term commitment by the Scottish Government with a degree of certainty for business investment. But identifying sites is not sufficient. And I want to pick up on the particular issue of housing. Articles have begun to appear about rising house prices to suggest to us that things are getting better in housing. But that's more of an indication of housing shortage rather than the indication of a healthy housing market. There's an increasing premium on existing housing because there's a severe shortage of new build. In fact, we're at a historic low. Not since the Second World War have we had so few housing starts. There's a huge economic cost to the country, to the construction industry, to the lack of jobs, and to our capacity to grow in the future with the small number of housing starts. But there's also a major social price to pay as well. Now, last month, the Minister spoke at a Women in Property event where he questioned whether we could expect the private sector to continue to contribute in the hard times to some of the infrastructure that local authorities now routinely expect to come as part of the planning process. Now, I think there is a debate to be had on that, because on one level the Minister is absolutely right. Private house building companies are facing immense challenges in developing sites. But if we simply say that the requirements to contribute infrastructure should be reduced, then it leaves a basic question as to where that shortfall will be made up. And in the current economic climate, local authorities are already strapped for cash, and while many are pursuing innovative investment strategies through tax incremental financing schemes, for example, if contributions to roads and schools don't come through alongside new development, we won't get the high-quality communities we aspire to. There simply isn't a straightforward alternative, and the Scottish Government need to understand that. I will do.
Minister? Can I thank Sarah Boyack for allowing me to make the point that what I was expressing, and I suppose I've done so repeatedly, is that Section 75 benefits should relate to the application, the mitigation of that development, and not the added extras that we know sometimes the public sector has acquired in more generous and plentiful times. So Section 75 is still appropriate, but should absolutely relate to the development in hand.
Sarah Boyack. But that could mean roads, it could mean public transport infrastructure, it could mean schools, it could mean energy, and I think we need to be much more specific about this. Edinburgh, for example, because of the lack of investment coming from the Scottish Government, is having to put its own money into housing associations so that we'll get any new housing investment for social housing, because we have a massive crisis in the city. So if the Scottish Government isn't requiring private development to put the money in, and it isn't itself prepared to put the money in, it's requiring local government to put the money in. And I think you need to be honest about that, and I think you need to actually accept the impact it will have on community development. Because local authorities and housing associations have been hit by a double whammy of cuts in housing investment for the SNP government and the impact of welfare reform from the Tory government, which has completely undermined the economics of affordable social rented housing. So we are in the middle of a crisis. And what is in the policy on the paper of this SPP in reality is not going to happen. And if you factor in the Christie Commission issues about changing demographics, there are even more challenges to local planning authorities in relation to new models of community development that meet the needs of a growing elderly population. And I just don't believe that what's written on the page in the SPP is going to deliver on the Minister's ambitions, because investment is going to be absolutely key. And one of the issues highlighted in the Climate Change Act was the issue of low-carbon housing. And it goes very much to the intervention the Minister has just made. The Act did not simply address the issue as one of individual house design, it was about the need for community, renewable heat and power schemes. And given the massive increases in costs that come from domestic energy and heat, it is not an issue for NPF4, it's an issue for now. And given the carbon emissions that come from housing, I wondered why, in reading the government motion, why energy infrastructure is not on the list alongside digital and transport infrastructure, because we don't just have a failure in terms of the market, in terms of housing, we have a failure in terms of the market, in terms of affordable heat and power as well. And only when local authorities such as Aberdeen have actually gone out to make it happen does it work. So it's not flagged up in the housing section, and although there's a section on energy, I think we've all been so focused on renewables in terms of wind farms that the fundamental issue of where is the heat and power going to come for our urban communities and for our communities as part of a housing process is just not joined up. And if community renewables is part of our vision for our towns, our villages and our cities, it won't just happen by accident. It doesn't just have to be planned for, it needs political leadership from the Scottish Government. Now, I've got a couple of minutes, so in my closing remarks, I just want to list a couple of other issues I think are really important. I think the RTPI is right to welcome a renewed focus on town centres. We've all seen the report in the last week or so that there's a possibility that over the next 4 years, 25% of our retail units in town centres will go. So the ambition, again, is good in the SPP, but I think we need a bit more oomph to go in beside that. And I think we need to put more emphasis on housing and residential developments in our centres as well, because we've had a flight of people from our city centres, and people want to live in city centres, but if all our developments are mixed commercial developments, then our town centres aren't going to survive, and we need to make sure that they are sustainable in the long run. I also want to make the comment about green infrastructure receiving huge support on the basis of tourism, nature conservation and low-carbon lifestyles generally. And there are references to long-distance walking and cycle routes. That's great, but it's got to be complemented by investment. And that's got to mean the Scottish Government investing more on national routes and greenlighting investment in our local communities too. We saw the ambition by the Pedal in Parliament demonstration last month, and the key point being made there was you need to be able to use your bike from your house to wherever you're going, and our streets are simply not safe enough. So it's not just about long-term routes, it's about local routes as well. Finally, there's a total absence of any proposals for new national parks. And even if a new national park was suggested in NPF3, it would still be years and years away. Surely it is time for our national parks in Loch Lomond and the Trossachs and the Cairngorms to be joined by another national park. What about our first marine and coastal national park? There's a lot about our seas and about our coastal communities and about ports development, which is welcome. And that makes the absence of a national park even more striking in our coastal and marine areas.
I must ask you
The
to
SPP
conclude.
is about how and the NPF is about where, as the RTPI say. I've focused my remarks about the purpose of planning and what should be in the purpose as set out by the SPP. I want to move my amendment because sustainable development has got to be the driver, not an afterthought. And at the moment, the SPP doesn't have it the right way around. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. We are quite tight for time in this debate, I should say at the outset. I now call on Margaret Mitchell to speak to and move Amendment 6933.1. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's debate on the publication of the main issues report for the third National Planning Framework and the consultation draft Scottish Planning Policy. Both the framework and policy documents have a vital role to play in supporting and promoting sustainable economic growth across Scotland. And this view is reflected in the Scottish Government motion, which is why the Scottish Conservatives will be voting in favour of the motion this evening. So the fact that an amendment to the motion has been tabled in my name does not indicate any significant disagreement with the sentiments expressed in the motion, but rather seeks to ensure that the importance of enforcement is highlighted. During a similar debate in January, the Minister may recall that the Scottish Conservatives emphasised that we consider enforcement to be a crucial part of an effective planning system. In that debate, the Minister and other members in the Chamber all acknowledged and agreed with this point. And it's encouraging that the draft SSP consultation document states that enforcement is a core value of the planning service, and the Minister has confirmed that he supports the amendment. For in reality, our planning system is only as good as the level of enforcement carried out to ensure compliance once decisions have been made. It is essential, therefore, that in deciding the final SPP, the Scottish Government ensures councils have robust, transparent and detailed planning enforcement charters that reflect modern conditions in order to safeguard the effectiveness of the planning system. In order to achieve this objective, there is an urgent requirement for more meaningful data on enforcement and how it currently operates. So it's a matter of concern that since the end of 2011-12, served planning enforcement notices are no longer broken down by type, which in turn makes it impossible to properly monitor the extent to which enforcement is working. As MSPs know only too well, examples of failure in enforcement are legion. This is a situation which must be addressed if the public is to have confidence in the system. Proper scrutiny of enforcement cannot be done without collecting hard empirical evidence and meaningful data. If you don't mind, I'm going to be really pressed for time, so I'll move on perhaps later. Turning now to some major aspects of the NPF3 main issues report, can I put on record at the outset that as a Central Scotland MSP, I'm heartened by the number of projects designated as national developments in the region. These include Central Scotland Green Network, whose areas cover all three of the Central Scotland region local authorities, the Grangemouth Investment Zone, the Grangemouth and Peterhead Carbon Capture Storage Project, and Ravenscraig, all of which is very good news. And it's anticipated that the development of Ravenscraig will lead to the creation of 12,000 jobs and make a significant contribution to the local economy, with new housing, education and leisure opportunities created. There are clearly, therefore, significant opportunities for regeneration and renewal at the Ravenscraig site, which will complement the new Motherwell College campus and the regional sports facility. In view of this, I sincerely hope that Ravenscraig remains one of the 14 new designations following the consultation. When the Minister gave evidence to the Local Government Committee on NPF3 and the SPP, one issue raised was the removal of the term brownfield site from the draft SPP. While I understand the possible connotations associated with the term, land contaminated in poor condition, then this is often not an accurate assessment of the land in question. So the term previous developed may make these sites sound more attractive. However, the term brownfield site is widely understood by the general public as designated land which can be developed quite distinct from greenfield sites. So I think on balance, then I think it would be helpful to retain that term. I also noted that in the same evidence session, the Minister indicated that the Town Centres Review will report shortly. Given Town Centre's first approach taken in the draft SPP, as well as the importance of the review of many of the other policy areas, I would be grateful if the Minister could confirm when the external advisory group will report. I hope that this will be prior to the close of the consultation so that it can help inform stakeholder responses to the draft SPP. Finally, in the Scottish Conservatives' most recent energy policy review, a Scotland-wide zoning exercise was suggested, with the resulting zoning plan to be included in the SPP. Zoning plan would clearly identify areas where wind farms or other renewable projects can never be granted planning permission, and also areas where they may be suitable. Given this, we cautiously welcome the draft SPP's suggestion for a more rigorous zoning system when it comes to onshore developments than presently exists. That said, although around 1/3 of the countryside is to be potentially protected by the proposed guidelines, there is no commitment from the SNP to reduce the overall number of turbines, and no sign that the enthusiasm for wind energy is beginning to wane. So in these circumstances, the fear is that zoning may simply result in more pressure on the remaining 2/3 of the country, which won't be spared in the guidelines. And also, I'm afraid, it comes too late for many communities in Scotland. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives agree with much of the NPF3 main issues report and the consultation draft SSP, as well as the commendable aims in these documents seek to achieve. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And I now call on Patrick Harvey to speak to and move Amendment 6933.2. 6 minutes, please, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank Margaret Mitchell as well for giving me the opportunity to begin by commending the Government for not allowing the suggestion that there will be a reduction in the number of wind turbines in Scotland, which would be a terrible situation to face were it to happen. Can I welcome this debate and the draft documents in front of us? It's a vitally important topic, and when I served on the Communities Committee in Session 2, which considered the planning legislation, every piece of evidence that we heard made it clearer and clearer that the planning system is one of the most important. It's perhaps one of the less sexy areas of government policy, but it's crucially important in terms of the future of our country, whatever the various different views about what that future should be. But the motion from the Government, I do find a wee bit curious. The term balanced growth is used. Not even the Government's favourite contradiction, sustainable economic growth, but this new term balanced growth. So I had a wee look, and I couldn't find anywhere in the whole of the Scottish Government's website any document or ministerial speech using the term balanced growth. Not, that is, since Jim Mather was in office, who I suspect used probably every bit of economic jargon ever invented in the history of the discipline. There are, as far as I'm aware, at least two established meanings in the magic circles of economics of the term balanced growth. But it's completely unclear to me which one the Government intends to use, and indeed when this quite radical change of economic policy was adopted. It certainly wasn't announced in any of the recent economic documents the Government published in relation to the future of an independent Scotland, for example. Maybe it's just a cobbled together phrase. Maybe it's in there without really meaning anything. I do think the Government needs to be clear when it uses phrases like this, what it really means. Either way, whether the Scottish Government...
Mike Mackenzie.
I've been listening very carefully to Patrick Harvey's speech so far, and I'm really completely unclear as to what it is that he means.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, I'm not in government. Mike Mackenzie might be grateful of that, but hopefully one day I'll have the chance to disappoint him. Either way, whether the Government has an actual definition of this term balanced growth, or whether it means sustainable economic growth, its favourite buzz phrase, either way, it's clear that growth dressed up in whatever jargon we like, it amounts to plain old GDP growth, has been placed as the central purpose of the planning system. And listening to the Minister's speech, it became very, very clear that that's foremost in his mind. Now, some members will, I'm sure, be comfortable with that. Some members still imagine that everlasting economic growth on a planet of finite resources is either possible or desirable. Some members imagine that economic growth in a wealthy country doesn't increase inequality or environmental destruction to benefit a few. But what the legislation says is not a matter of debate. What the legislation says is black and white, passed by this Parliament. Sustainable development, exercise of functions by Scottish ministers. The section applies to the Scottish ministers in the exercise of their functions of preparing and revising the national planning framework. The Scottish ministers must exercise those functions with the objective of contributing to sustainable development. Now, it's pretty clear that the government has now decided that instead of the objective of sustainable development, instead the government decides to place a range of objectives, starting with economic growth and with sustainability some way down the list. I find this deeply disappointing. I also find it out of keeping with the legislation. I give way to the Minister.
Minister.
Just to make the brief point that surely any reasonable person reading the priorities in MPF3 will come to a clear conclusion that the transition to a low-carbon economy is a central driver in our planning policies.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, there is indeed mention of climate change in particular. But I wonder whether a national planning framework and an SPP which was focused on sustainable development would have at its heart some proposals, particularly on energy, which are quite out of keeping with the objectives on climate change, to which the whole Parliament has on paper signed up. Coal gasification, for example. Fracking. The actual suggestion on, I think, page 23 of the SPP that unconventional fuels are seen as an opportunity, not as a threat. The idea that a world which already has several times more fossil fuel already known, already reserves, than we can afford to burn, the idea that we just go chasing after ever more, deep water drilling one day, open cast coal the next, and in future fracking or other unconventional gas extraction. This is not compatible with sustainable development. It is not compatible with the government's own climate change objectives. There are certainly things to welcome in the Minister's documents, and I've reflected that in my amendment. There is also much to welcome in the other two amendments in terms of the CO2 target arguments from the Labour Party, and certainly enforcement is a particular priority that the Conservatives introduced, and I'm happy to support that. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, on democratic accountability and participation, I suspect this has been improved since the court case over the Hunterston coal-fired power station, where 26 people responded to the consultation on its status as a national development, but 22,000 objected to the development when it was put forward. Parliament will enter into a more formal period of scrutiny of the new NPF at a later stage, but through that process, local democratic accountability must remain a priority, and I urge the Government to consider that in revising the draft. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. We are quite tight for time. Speeches of 6 minutes. Mike Mackenzie, to be followed by John Pentland.
Presiding Officer, I'm delighted that we've received so many briefings in this debate from so many interested organisations, because one of the problems the planning system suffers from is public apathy, especially during the earlier consultation phases of planning policy. And that's why I'm glad that the Scottish Government is leading the way with both the main issues report for National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy consultation, and especially in producing the associated documents in plain and clear English, which are in the main uncluttered and free from planning jargon. There is a lesson for local planning authorities in this, because early public engagement and meaningful consultation depend on such documents being accessible to the wider public. Too often, reading local planning policy documents is an exercise in forcing your way through a dense lexicon of tortured and ambiguous terms, and an exercise that's reminiscent of attempting to read some of our more esoteric postmodernist literature, which is meaningless to absolutely everyone except perhaps the author. And I'm glad too that the Scottish Government is forging ahead in a journey of continuous improvement for our planning system, because it is a system that's too often in the past let us all down, applicants and the public, and not delivered the outcomes that any of us would wish for, neither in efficiency, in fairness, nor, and most importantly, in delivering quality of development. I'm particularly glad about the emphasis in the SPP draft on design-led development, with its attendant themes of placemaking, of designing better streets, the architectural and place policy statement, and high-quality development. And while I welcome the new planning performance framework, I'm sorry to see that the first planning performance annual report suggests that less than a third of local planning authorities have stated that design improvements are negotiated during the application process. That represents a disappointment to me. Too much the focus has been about answering the question of whether to build or not to build, rather than asking questions about the quality of design. This is an area of the planning system that needs to improve, because NIMBYism is often an expression of a lack of public confidence in the planning system as the vehicle for delivering well-designed and high-quality development. I'm glad too, Presiding Officer, about the renewed focus on sustainable economic growth. Not to think about this in our hierarchy of considerations is not to live in the real world. It's not to recognise the profound economic difficulties many people face in communities throughout Scotland. And it's not to recognise that we've got two possible futures, one in which we face continuing poverty, or a better and well-designed one in which we can all share the prosperity that sustainable economic growth will deliver. The planning system, I'm sorry, the presiding officers told us we're short of time, and I think I should move on. The planning system should be the midwife of that well-designed and better future. I'm surprised, therefore, at Patrick Harvey's amendment, because I would have thought that the word sustainable, as the constant prefix of economic growth, would answer all of his concerns. Sure.
Patrick Harvey.
I wonder if Mr Mackenzie can do what no Scottish Government Minister has ever done yet, and give a clear, unambiguous definition of what the hell sustainable economic growth even is.
Mike Mackenzie.
I think you're being deliberately misunderstanding. I think it's difficult in a short number of words to say precisely what the meaning is. But nevertheless, I think we all understand exactly what it means. I would have thought also that Patrick would welcome NPF3 with its ambitious programme of infrastructure projects necessary to secure our renewable energy generation opportunities, which are so especially required if we are to take Professor Stiglitz's advice about the opportunities of moving towards the green economy. Presiding Officer, I've long been a fan of another Patrick Geddes, the father of modern planning. He saw planning as the means of dealing with many of our socio-economic problems, and I'm very glad to see that the Scottish Government are following this philosophy.
Before I call the next speaker, can I just reassure the Chamber that members can have their full 6 minutes. We just don't have a lot of time in hand for compensation for interventions. Can I remind members to use full names to speak through the Chair, and also to be mindful of the language that they use in the Chamber. I call John Pentland, to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Minister is well aware, I have welcomed the inclusion of Ravenscraig as a national priority, and hope to see its redevelopment not only consolidated within the NPF3, but significantly boosted as a consequence of its enhanced status, both through the extension of Scottish Government support and through attracting increased investment from the private sector. Now, thinking back to the works that once lit up the night sky, it's worth noting that the Ravenscraig has that potential once again to be the shining beacon. But this time as an exemplary new community where sustainable development has been built as part of the design process, with a town centre integrated with workplaces, homes, schools, shopping, leisure and community facilities, as well as parks and wildlife areas, all linked by state-of-the-art and environmentally friendly public transport. Now, given that these are the objectives that the National Planning Framework seeks to pursue, low carbon, sustainable, connected, it seems very appropriate that Ravenscraig should be a prominent aspect of the NPF3. The Minister will also be aware of my concerns that the Scottish planning policy needs to make it clear that planning authorities should be prepared and able to abandon excessively strict adherence to planning by numbers when balancing the competing needs of communities. Now, this is not to say that there should be a free-for-all which ignores carefully considered planning objectives. Rather, we should not allow the resulting rules to become fixed tablets of stone that get in the way of pursuing these objectives. Now, while welcoming the general thrust of the NPF3 and the SPP, I have some concerns about the interpretation and the mechanisms and resources that will be available to support the vision that is being presented. There are also concerns raised in several of the briefings we received and likely to be repeated in the submissions to the consultation about whether a change in language reflects a change in policy. Now, this is a significant concern. Does referring to sustainable economic growth, which is a poorly defined concept compared to the legally defined term sustainable development, mean that economic considerations will be given greater weight than the social and environmental consequences of development? That is the fear. The Local Government in Scotland Act 2003 requires local authorities to discharge their duty to seek best value in a way which contributes to the achievement of sustainable development, and the statutory guidance of that Act defines sustainable development as development which secures a balance of social, economic and environmental well-being and the impact of activities and decisions, and which seeks to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this is of course a definition that builds on the one given in the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future. Now, compared to that, how are we to interpret the emphasis of sustainable economic growth? The worry is that by emphasising the need for maintaining economic growth, just a wee minute, we are discounting or undervaluing resources that do not directly contribute to the economic growth statistics. So will we take proper account of social and environmental aspects of development? Will we ensure the protection and growth of our natural capital, our human capital and our social capital, as well as the financial variety? Now, this question could easily be settled now in this debate by clarifying the Scottish Government's interpretation of sustainable economic growth and promising to reaffirm the Scottish Government's commitment to sustainable development when the final document is published.
Minister.
Thank the member for giving me that opportunity. Yes, the Scottish Government is just as committed to sustainable development as it ever was. And what's more, the very project Mr Pentland wants us to deliver in Ravenscraig is an example of that, from brownfield regeneration to create jobs, housing, industry and employment opportunities. A wonderful example of that planning in practice. So yes, we are just as committed, and I hope that for once and for all puts that matter to bed.
John Pentland, final minute.
That's why I allowed you the intervention, Minister. Of course, making commitments to low-carbon places and economies is one thing, Backing up those commitments with action is another. And it remains to be seen whether Scottish Government will move from wishful thinking to firm commitments in its final report on policies and proposals. But failing to meet targets for the second year in a row does not augur well. Now, getting the right policies on transport and housing are crucial to meeting our climate change targets. And as I said when talking about housing associations last week, current support does not make it easy to build good quality, low carbon social housing. Relying on using up reserves is not very sustainable, nor is the sort of prudential policy that the Scottish Housing Regulator called for. Overall, I agree with the direction of travel that we are offered in these documents, but I would like to see greater commitment to speedier implementation and resources to match that commitment. I know the Minister says that this is a planning document and not a spending document. However, the danger is that, like the draft RPP2, the NPF3 becomes a wish list of things that we would like to do, rather than a firm commitment to what will be achieved and a roadmap saying how we get there.
You must conclude.
Now, the Minister has clearly put a lot of effort into the NPF3, getting his Cabinet colleagues on board.
I'm afraid you really need to
Can he be sure he will get the same buy-in from his Cabinet colleagues when it comes to providing the resources needed to put the plan into practice? Perhaps the Minister could answer that in his summing up.
Thank you. Chick Brodie, to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the debate today and the intent of the motion, and indeed have some sympathy with the amendments from Labour and Conservatives. This motion, NPF 3, which builds on NPF 2, the consultation on SPP, Scottish planning policy, are welcome, and I congratulate the Minister and his team for bringing it forward. I have one caveat, however, and I haven't spoken to my friend, Mr Mackenzie, before I enter the general fray of the debate. These proposals, that consultation affects and will affect everyone in Scotland. So in the production of these reports, and it's not just this department's reports, can we start to put them within the linguistic reach of those that are being affected from them? For example, consider section 164 of Scottish planning policy, and I quote, "Proposals that would result in or exacerbate a deficit of green infrastructure should include provision to remedy that deficit with an accessible infrastructure," and so on and so on. I really appeal to this Minister and others for a simpler and more linguistically inclusive reporting method. Presiding Officer, the principal policy objective of the motion refers to, and rightly so, for Scotland to flourish through increasing sustainable economic growth. And let me help Mr Harvey and others struggling with this shorthand for saying, before we can do all of the other things we want to do, including sustainable development and a greener infrastructure, before we can do all of these things, what we have to do, through sound financial and sound planning systems, is to build all the elements of our productive environment, find and build new ones, all continuously and continuing as a priority, harnessing simultaneously a fairer, healthier nation that secures with substance. No, I won't take. We could go on debating what this means all day, and I don't intend to. We can do with substance to attain meaningful, further planned sustainable development, and, as I said, the greener environment that we all seek. In that context, Presiding Officer, let me address two areas where, rightly, the planning framework and the SPP will deliver improvement. We are nothing if we do not consider our communities, our town centres and the people within them. Presiding Officer, Scotland will attain its target of producing 100% of its electricity needs from renewables by 2020. I would suggest, however, that one of the vehicles adopted to achieve wind farm developments, namely community benefits, these are benefits that may be offered voluntarily by developers to communities likely to be affected by the development, is not the only right vehicle as proposed in the planning document. A feature, indeed, that has now been exacerbated and exaggerated by the London Government's recent threat to quadruple community benefits to developers. Whatever way we dress these up, they are inducements, and some may even say they are bribes, to communities. And sometimes, and only in a few cases, inducements are offered to the selected few elected members of community councils, to that few who can then dispose and disperse the largesse as they see fit, thus embellishing and exaggerating perceived power within the community, and sometimes in the process creating animosity therein. I would ask the Minister to amend or add to this portion of the plan an element in favour of greater community ownership of developments, not just on wind farms, but certainly these, where ownership comes in the form of profit sharing from a development, or dividends from the community's equity share in a wind farm. In a development, and I have to say I applaud this because we've just experienced it after many, many discussions that we've had with developers, more progressive wind farm developers, of introducing and funding a domestic fuel discount scheme to reduce fuel bills in the community to which the wind farm is attached. And that said, the planning system, and indeed our future land systems planning, no, I'm sorry, we don't have time, land systems planning might address the financial benefits that flow from these planning developments to landowners, some of whom wouldn't know Scotland if they landed on it. And finally, Presiding Officer, I address items 54 to 67 of the planning policy. The principles, the delivery and the development plans of our town centres. On town centres, the consultation proposes that local authorities should prepare strategies predicated per the list drawn up, long list drawn up in paragraph 56 of the Scottish Planning Policy document. Well, in some areas we were supposed to have done that already, even pumping substantial monies to assist in the renaissance of our town centres. The challenge is that the last of that long list, that proposed list of actions in the SPP, calls for monitoring against a baseline provided by a health check to assess the extent to which it has delivered improvements. I invite the Minister, I appeal to him, to ensure that there is a meaningful regular review strategy, an audit of strategy and finance of groups responsible for the development of these town centres and their planning outcomes. Presiding Officer, NPF 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy provide meaningful frameworks to establish sustainable growth of our people, of our betterment, of our economy and of our nation.
Thank you very much. I now call Anne McTaggart to be followed by John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, I am delighted, as always, to contribute to the debate in this afternoon's debate on Scotland's third National Planning Framework, and to consider how we best ensure that planning contributes towards the wider economic recovery. I am keen that the third framework builds on the commendable principles contained within previous planning strategies and would encourage the Scottish Government to be aspirational in confronting some of the biggest challenges that we are likely to face in the decades ahead. I note that the Local Government Minister, Derek Mackay, has stated the key priorities of the NPF 3 will be supporting sustainable economic growth. And I, like others this afternoon, also feel that the Scottish Government's focus on the phrase sustainable economic growth is somewhat ambiguous, and it is much less clearly defined than the previously used phrase sustainable development, which already has a legal basis. I am sure the Scottish Government wishes to be clear in its aims. However, certainly.
Kenneth Gibson.
Just for clarification, the OECD definition of sustainable economic growth is upward trend in environmentally adjusted net domestic product, EDP, under certain conditions and assumptions, ergo the rate of growth that can be maintained without exhausting natural resources and creating problems for future generations. Oh, that clarifies it for everyone.
Anne McTaggart.
I'm sure that's us all learned something new today. However, supporting sustainable development and the transition to a low-carbon economy are both themes that I'd like to extend my support to and acknowledge the benefits brought to the overall strategy through the close working relationships that have been developed with Visit Scotland, Scottish Wildlife Trust, Climate Exchange and other key stakeholders throughout the consultation process. In such challenging economic circumstances, it is necessary that we prioritise those infrastructure projects that will encourage tourism and inward investment in Scotland, safeguarding jobs and promoting growth. I back the move to decarbonise our transport network and to improve key transport links between our cities. However, the Parliament will be aware that the Scottish Government has already missed its targets for carbon reduction, with expert analysis predicting that every annual target from 2014 onwards will also be unachievable. Bearing this in mind, that 40% of the emissions are coming from transport and housing, we can clearly see that this is an issue. It's an incredibly important aspect to the planning debate. That is why we need more than just hollow commitments from the Scottish Government on what they are able to deliver, and some assurances about the resources that will enable the public and voluntary sectors to achieve the long-term aspirations contained within the National Planning Framework. I am, however, also concerned by the suggestions that 1 in 4 of our high street stores will disappear over the coming years, as stated in the Retail Futures 2018 report by the Centre for Retail Research only last month. We must look to our high streets and start the debate on how we can use the planning system to regenerate our towns and city centres in order to address the ever-changing face of our high streets. I am sure the Minister for Local Government will be aware of this recent report and will acknowledge that this represents almost 5,800 individual stores and probably in excess of 100,000 workers who will be made redundant if there is no effective interventions put in place to speed up the recovery of our town centres. It is because of these facts that I urge the Scottish Government to ensure that it does not take a short-term view of the planning system, because this could only have long-term consequences. I truly hope that the third framework will continue in the same vein as the previous planning strategies, and that the Scottish Government listens to the concerns on the finer points of the strategies that have been placed to the Chamber this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call John Wilson to be followed by Jim Hume.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome today's debate on the Scottish Planning Policy and National Planning Framework 3, particularly with an interest at being a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, which recently took evidence from the Minister on this issue. And during the meeting with the Local Government and with the committee, the Minister gave some insight into the finer details of the proposals and was able to offer the committee members some useful assurances on the direction and focus of the development of SPP and NPF3. May I firstly take this opportunity to praise the Minister on the fact that NPF3 and SPP are being looked at in tandem. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who has become bogged down in the ever-confusing raft of planning legislation and guidelines when dealing with constituency cases. Efforts to coordinate guidelines will undoubtedly bring greater clarity, hopefully. In regards to the NPF3, I commend the focus being placed upon economic benefits and jobs in consideration of the proposed developments in the draft. It is important to place economic factors at the heart of all major decisions, particularly during this time of austerity. I also welcome the nod to regeneration of town centres, although, as I highlighted to the Minister during the committee meeting in May, I do caution that proposing major new developments may conflict with the Scottish planning policy focus on existing town centres, as Anne McTaggart's just highlighted. In particular, I would note that the proposals at Ravenscraig, for example, may conflict with the Scottish planning policy in that the developments will effectively create a new town to bridge the geographical gap between the existing towns of Motherwell and Wishaw. This could create greater problems for these existing town centres. I raised this point with the Minister at the committee meeting in May and noted that the current proposals for the Ravenscraig development include housing, education facilities and the possibility of a new retail centre, effectively creating a new town. While I appreciate that the proposed developments will bring massive benefits to communities throughout the Central Belt, so too would developing areas which have, throughout recent years, suffered significant decline. Although I am not suggesting that we halt all major new developments, I would suggest any potential conflict is ironed out in the new framework and a better balance found. During the Minister's appearance at the committee, I also sought assurances that the guidance issued in December will be more precise in regards to how planning authorities make decisions. I noted, for example, that autonomous decision-making between local authority areas has at times been inconsistent, particularly in relation to the erection of wind turbines. This in turn leads to confusion and uncertainty for those living in communities which border neighbouring authorities. Clarity for all concerned is therefore crucial as both the NPF3 and SPP are taken forward. I was pleased to hear from the Minister that the Scottish Government will be working with Community Council liaison officers and Planning Aid for Scotland to ensure that communities are provided with the help and support they need to engage fully in the planning system. But not only communities, it is essential that all those involved in the planning process, from the Scottish Government to local authority departments and developers, work closely together to bring about the speedy disposal of planning applications. Creating a more cohesive and inclusive approach to the planning process will in turn bring about greater efficiency and better decision-making with minimal delays. I would like to highlight at this point a discussion I had with a developer last Friday, where an area that has been identified as a community growth area. The developer's having problems sitting down with not the planning department of a local authority, but other departments trying to identify what the community gain or the community obligations will be on those developers when they go ahead with the development. This is leading to delays in house building at the present time, Presiding Officer. And clearly we need to make sure that local authorities work collectively with developers to ensure that these developments can go ahead in a speedy fashion for the economic benefit of all those concerned. A good approach to planning can bring many benefits both at national and local level, and bringing planning policy back to local communities is an important step forward. The publication of the National Planning Framework 3 Main Issues Report in April 2013, prior to NPF3 going out for consultation, is a step in the right direction by providing an avenue for local communities affected by the proposed national developments to make their opinions known at an early stage. The fact that NPF3 and SPP are being put out to consultation simultaneously will hopefully not only prove cost-effective and potentially limit consultation fatigue, but should go a long way to ensuring a more cohesive approach as we move forward. Presiding Officer, the Minister must bring confidence to all those affected by planning decisions, that their views are heard and views taken on board prior to decisions being made. I would like to thank all those organisations who have contributed to this debate and look forward over the coming months to further discussions on the issues raised today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call Jim Hume, can I just say some members have not used up their full allocation of time, and therefore there is a few seconds in hand if members wish to take interventions from this stage onwards. Jim Hume, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this opportunity to debate the Scottish Government's ongoing work in producing a third national planning framework and updated Scottish planning policy. This third national planning framework is a vitally important document for two reasons in my view. The first is obvious, as it serves as the long-term strategy for the development of nationally important projects central to the Scottish Government's key objectives. The second reason is that this is the first NPF to be produced against the backdrop of a difficult financial climate. As a result, the document must have a strong focus on economic growth and increasing the attractiveness of Scotland as an area of global investment opportunities. And to do so, the Scottish Government must ensure that our infrastructure and environment are fit for purpose. So I do welcome this consultation process. The main issues report rightly highlights that housing is a key policy concern due to the projected increase in Scottish households over the next 2 decades, with the strain being felt particularly in certain areas. One such area is East Lothian in South Scotland region, and I know that there are particular challenges in sourcing appropriate land for development due to much of it being high-quality arable land, but nonetheless land will need to be sourced. The Scottish Government have blamed the economic downturn for the much lower than expected level of housing development since the NPF2 was published. Of course, this can't be overlooked as a factor, but neither can the reduction in subsidy, of course, available to housing associations, which has fallen from 70 to 40,000 per home. This was a decision, of course, entirely of the Scottish Government's making, and as revealed last week, has contributed to a 32% reduction in housing association completions. Someone was asking
John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would Mr Hume agree with the statement I made in my contribution that some of the delays that are caused to housing developments are coming from local authorities, not acting in a manner or as speedily as they could do to resolve the issues regarding the development decisions?
I'm sure that's quite correct, but I think it's also quite correct that housing associations are having difficulty, obviously, with funding, as I've said. But when you consider the sharp decline in approvals and starts for homes for social rent, it's clear that attempts to achieve the Scottish Government's flagship housing target will be further complicated in the subsequent years of this Parliament. I absolutely accept that developers have had difficulty in securing finance as well, but the Government can't absolve itself of all the responsibilities on this. One other thing I was particularly keen to see discussed in both documents was onshore wind developments. As a South Scotland member, my inbox is dominated by concerns over developments throughout my region, some of which are clearly in inappropriate locations. Indeed, only on Monday I was in Strayton in Ayrshire, speaking to constituents concerned about plans to erect over 130 giant turbines in their stunningly beautiful valley. Local authorities and my constituents are really crying out for clear national guidance from the Scottish Government to help ensure a fairer and more robust planning process. Unfortunately, the draft Scottish planning policy is somewhat weak on this by insisting that, and I quote, "we remain of the view that planning authorities are best placed to plan for onshore wind at the local level." I am of the view that to establish the very commendable target of at least 100% of gross electricity consumption from renewables by 2020, to then tell councils to get on with it when they are inundated with onshore wind applications, is an example of backpassing. And it must also be noted that I see more and more of some of these developments being of the larger stuff style, which goes straight to Scottish Government. Yeah, of course.
Minister.
If I have time.
If the member believes that it's not a matter for local authorities to find the right sites, then it must be for someone else. Does the member suggest we centralise all these decisions in Edinburgh, or indeed at the Reporters in Falkirk, all wind farm locations?
Jim Hume.
No, I think we should have a strategy for Scotland. I think we should have a broad consultation and find a good strategy for Scotland where we can decide where best wind farms should be, and rather than the property developers going around and actually leading the way. I've agreed with the Minister when he gave evidence to the Local Government Committee that developments needed to be in the right places, but it's not enough for the Scottish Government to state its wish that national parks and national scenic areas will remain untouched. That's not a definitive statement in itself, and it's time a clear national guidance was produced, as I've said. I was pleased to see as a national development the creation and the improvement of long-distance paths and trails. Coincidentally, only yesterday, a joint report by Sustrans Scotland and Transform Scotland was highlighting that cycling tourism is worth about £240 million annually. I would hope that with the plans outlined in this document, this further could be improved upon significantly. As well as the obvious tourism marketing potential of a walking and cycling network across Scotland's outstanding landscapes, it would also help in improving active travel among Scots and have the dual benefits of promoting healthier and less polluting forms of travel. There is no doubt that the main issues report has some worthwhile national objectives, such as Ravenscraig, electricity grid reinforcements, Central Scotland Green Network and improvements to our ports. Make Scotland more competitive and should assist in meeting our climate change obligations, which regretfully we're not currently fulfilling. Failure to achieve our climate change targets for the second time should be a serious concern for the Scottish Government and all of us, of course, and I welcome the focus on transitioning transitioning Scotland towards a low-carbon economy. But of course, talk is cheap, and the objectives laid out in the document must be followed through with greater commitment and energy than has currently been displayed, that is, if we're ever to achieve our legally binding emissions obligations. Thank you.
Many thanks. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is an important issue which will help to develop policies, plans and frameworks that will determine the future development of Scotland. And as this is such a wide-ranging topic and our time is somewhat limited, I'm going to just limit myself to a few key issues, and these include regeneration of previously developed sites, the role of public involvement within the planning system, and also the future of tourism as a growth sector within our economy. And I would also like to thank the Minister for his appearance at the Local Government and Regeneration Committee in May, where today's issue actually was discussed. That particular meeting allowed members of the committee, including myself, to actually question him on key aspects of the future of the planning system in Scotland. And during the session, I was pleased to hear the Minister state that he wanted a planning system that will actually focus on delivering jobs and growth whilst investing in infrastructure. Now, this reflects the 2011 manifesto commitment by the SNP that a more efficient and effective planning system will be good for investment and growth. And that is an approach I'm sure actually will be welcomed by many here today. The Minister also stated that the Scottish Government is committed to making the transition to a sustainable, growing, low-carbon economy the primary focus of the proposals for the third National Planning Framework. And as part of this, there has to be a focus on the areas which have previously been developed but are now effectively economically challenging communities. Now, for these areas, regeneration is vital. And with that, I certainly was delighted to hear John Pentland's comments earlier regarding Ravenscraig and his welcome of Ravenscraig actually being included as one of the areas for national development. There are far too many of these sites within the west of Scotland, certainly within Scotland as a whole, but certainly within the west of Scotland. And certainly with that, I'm happy that certainly the Firth of Clyde area has certainly been considered within the National Planning Framework as one of the areas that's been identified where major change is happening or anticipated to guide the implementation of the national strategy. Certainly within the Firth of Clyde area, also some of the key issues certainly include the regeneration, the green infrastructure and the supporting investment in key economic sectors. I touched upon regeneration there. There are, within the west of Scotland, there have been far too many areas where actually regeneration is such an issue. And we need to certainly encourage investment and encourage investment and development into these particular areas to actually breathe new life into these communities. And the focus of the new planning framework and planning policy on economic growth will hopefully result in such developments that can stimulate local economies and bring in much needed employment. And it's good to hear the Minister talk of removing the barriers of planning from the economic development of our country. And I'm certainly, with some of the comments already today, certainly that has actually been one of the key, obstacles in some instances. And I know that certainly has been the case in some local authority areas within the west of Scotland as well. However, I do think it's important that the view of the public is certainly not ignored. And I'm pleased that the use of charrettes, the promoting the early engagement and the early intervention is to be rolled out. And I'm sure that this will actually help improve community involvement in the planning process and hopefully ensure that future developments, whilst promoting jobs and growth, will also have a significant input from the local economy and also from the local elected members. And certainly one of the things that within the Local Government Committee today we started out in our regeneration inquiry. But one of the key points from today, but also when we were going through other pieces of work within the committee, has been the issue of community involvement. And instead of things being done to the community, it's to actually make sure that the community actually genuinely has a full and thorough input into what's actually going on. Because without that, then communities are certainly not going to fully progress. Public involvement in the planning system is crucial, and allowing local communities to actually have their say at the pre-application stage through charrettes or some other process will help to allay any fears and also allow developers to adjust their plans to minimise local objections. Now, this move can actually help make planning a more consensual activity than it sometimes actually has been, when some communities actually feel as if their views just simply have been ignored. Now, turning to the issue of tourism, now this is an important element of the Scottish economy, but there is still more scope for extra investment and jobs throughout this sector. And the Main Issues report also explores how the framework can support sustainable tourism. At the committee session, I raised the issue of cruise ships and the huge success of the cruise ship market to the Scottish economy. So in the last year, some over £42 million came into the Scottish economy as a consequence of cruise ship tourism. I raised this particular point with the Minister. I also raised the point that certainly in the month of May, over 10,000 passengers had actually visited Greenock through cruise ships, and highlighting the scope and the extent of the tourism potential within Inverclyde. And this industry clearly plays a huge role in bringing in additional revenue to the Scottish economy, but also to the Inverclyde economy. Yet the Port of Greenock has had to turn away some vessels this year. It will be turning away vessels this year due to a lack of capacity. However, I do know that there are discussions underway between the Scottish Government and the owners and the operators of the Port in Greenock to see whether there is any way assistance can actually be provided, and I certainly welcome this. I was pleased with the Minister's response to my question.
Should we drawing to a close, please?
Okay, I was pleased with the Minister's response that day, and certainly I would hope that some successful outcome actually can take place. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I do welcome the debate on the National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy, and it certainly does help to set out the context of a modern planning system with the focus on regeneration and growth, and I'm sure it certainly will be successful for Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd first like to apologise to Anne McTaggart for not thanking her for accepting my intervention earlier on today. The current economic climate makes it more important than ever that we ensure a well-considered and detailed planning framework which will help support recovery, attract investment to Scotland, create the maximum number of jobs and bring the greatest benefit to our society. Of course, economic benefits, whilst vitally important, must not be allowed to undermine Scotland's natural environment, and we must also be mindful of our contribution and commitment to the reduction of harmful greenhouse gases. I believe that this draft National Planning Framework, more so than NFP2, meets both of these key requirements. As MSP for Cunningham North, I have to say that for my constituents, the most important aspect of NPF3 is the removal of any possibility that a coal-fired power station could be built at Hunterston in my constituency. This issue is one I long campaigned against, along with community and environmental groups, for a number of years. Indeed, I contacted every adult in the communities that would have been affected, detailing how they could register their opposition to the proposal, and submitted my own 28-page objection to the Scottish Energy Consents Units in August 2010. The application to build the power station generated some 21,000 objections, more than any other application in Scottish planning history. Happily, in the face of such vociferous opposition, and also due to funding uncertainty, Ayrshire Power Limited ultimately withdrew their application to build this unwanted power plant. SNP councils and North Ayrshire Council supported and delivered the removal of the potential coal plant from the local development plan, and for a host of other reasons it is now highly unlikely that a similar application will be submitted. However, that possibility remained of great concern to local residents and environmental groups. Of course, I do not believe this decision should be taken purely on the basis of local opposition. Looking at this within a national context, its continued inclusion would be contrary to the stated objectives of the Scottish Government. Paul Wheelhouse, MSP Minister for Environment and Climate Change, recently reaffirmed the Scottish Government's commitment to combating climate change, stating, and I quote, "A low-carbon economy is not only essential to address our need to reduce global emissions, but it will bring significant economic benefits and opportunities for our communities, businesses and industry and our environment. That is why we are committed to working with the people of Scotland to maximise those opportunities and address possibly the greatest challenge facing society today." I completely agree with the Minister, and whilst I recognise that Scotland's emissions have already fallen by 24.3% since 1990, ahead of the rest of the UK, and we are now halfway to achieving our world-leading target of reducing emissions by 42% by 2020, allowing, let alone encouraging construction of a coal-fired power station at Hunterston would have been a step in the wrong direction. As such, on the 9th of November 2012, I submitted a detailed response to the consultation on NPF3 requesting that a new power station at Hunterston be removed. I also corresponded and discussed the matter of the power station's removal with the Minister for Local Government and Planning, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth and the Minister for Energy, Enterprise and Tourism. I'm therefore particularly pleased that the Scottish Government has listened to such concerns and those of my constituents, and the Government now, and I quote, do not consider there to be a need to retain a new power station at Anderson as a national development in NPF3. And in a second, and this will reassure my constituents by taking the decision to remove any potential for a coal-fired power station at Anderson from NPF3. This will be a great relief to my constituents.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, and I strongly commend Mr Gibson for his work on the issue of the Hunterston coal-fired power station. But isn't there still a difficulty with a situation where we consult on what should be designated as national priorities, and he is one of only 26 individuals responded opposing the Hunterston coal-fired plant, and it took 22,000 individual objections to oppose the actual development? Don't we still need to do better on local democratic accountability?
Kenneth Gibson.
Let's do better, actually. I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, to be fair, in actual fact, the application took a very long time to actually come to fruition. And, of course, there was a public inquiry put forward and the application was withdrawn before that was obviously concluded. But, of course, more democratic accountability is always something we should work towards. Regarding energy production and the environment, I was pleased to note that proposals being brought forward may outlaw the construction of wind farms in Scotland's national parks and designated scenic areas. Whilst onshore wind energy is clearly an important part of Scotland's progressive blend of energy production, this is certainly a welcome development and will do much to ensure Scotland retains its place as one of the most scenic nations of the world. Previously, I had attempted to bring forward a Members' Bill to protect Scotland's regional parks from such developments, but found that after 2 years of deliberations and discussions with the Non-Executive Bills Unit, that the reserved provisions of the 1989 Electricity Act made this impossible. I'm therefore keen to hear from the Government how this protection for national parks will be achieved, and if they will consider extending such protections to regional parks, which surely should be classified as scenic areas and deserve to be safeguarded. Again, in terms of my local constituency, I'm pleased to note that the updated airport enhancements incorporating wider plans for investment, including improvements to surface access, airport facilities and the creation of master plans for Glasgow and Prestwick airports. Improvements to both of these key transport hubs, I'm confident, will help ensure Scotland continues to punch above its weight in terms of foreign direct investment, help mitigate the adverse impact of air passenger duty on these airports and create and sustain jobs. Commitments to high-speed rail between Glasgow and Edinburgh and also south to London are also extremely welcome and will offer Scotland a competitive advantage when delivered in terms of creating a rail service to serve those wishing to do business in Scotland and the general public. Against the backdrop of cuts to public spending and reduced private investment, the measures contained within NPF3 are to be welcomed and set out a clear and ambitious development strategy for the next 20 to 30 years. This framework delivers on a number of fronts, helping to create jobs, making Scotland an attractive place to do business and to invest in. But further to this, it's conscious of Scotland's unique scenic landscapes and is mindful of our global responsibility to help protect our environment for ourselves and future generations.
Many thanks. I now call on Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Presiding Officer, I should first confess that I've probably done less on planning than any other policy area apart from rural affairs over the last 7 years, but I did enjoy reading the National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy consultation document and indeed the official report of the Minister's appearance before the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. And I would certainly welcome much of what is in the documents. I think the most significant change in the Scottish planning policy is generally admitted is in relation to onshore wind, and I think everybody is welcoming what is proposed there. I would also welcome what is said in the National Planning Framework about offshore wind, the need to develop infrastructure for the expansion of offshore wind, and I particularly thank the Minister for giving Leith a mention at page 25, and I certainly look forward to offshore wind manufacturers starting in Leith, I hope, before too long. I think in general the new national developments should be welcome because I think nearly all of them seem to be related to renewable energy and climate change, which doesn't take away from some of the wider concerns about climate change that Patrick Harvey and Sarah Boyack raised. Housing has also been raised, and I think the way in which there is a more generous allocation of land recommended for housing is another important part of the Scottish planning policy. So in general, I welcome the documents, but it's one thing to have a policy, another to have implemented. And I noticed when the Minister was giving evidence that he himself said that the interpretation of Scottish planning policy across the country was too variable, and I think that does raise the issue which has always run through planning debates about the tension between different players in the planning system, and obviously this featured very strongly in debates around the Planning Act in 2006. There's the community, there's local authorities, there's the government, but also I remember in 2006 there was relative powers of the government and Parliament, and at that time I should tell the Minister his backbenchers, including Bruce Crawford at that time, were arguing that the Parliament should have the final say on the national planning framework, so I'm not sure if Bruce Crawford would still say that today. So we have all those particular tensions, and I suppose my own prejudice is to give a bit more power and influence to communities. I think there was progress with the Act in terms of early involvement, and obviously we've had the participation statement for the National Planning Framework and a lot of engagement, but I think in general communities probably still feel that they would like to have a bigger say, and perhaps it will surprise the Minister and others for me to say that possibly I think there should be a bit more power sometimes given to the government, because I was concerned when the requirements on notification by local authorities to the government, which were quite strong in 2006, were weakened a few years later by the current government, because I do think that does keep a check on what can sometimes appear to be the arbitrary power of local governments. And perhaps Sarah Bark will forgive me for reminding, well, I suppose telling a lot of people who weren't there at the time that she actually supported a community right of notification in 2006 and indeed voted against me and the government of the day on that very matter, something that would never happen, I know, with SNP backbenchers these days. But she did have a point, because we do need checks and balances in the system, and it does worry me sometimes that nobody can really stop local government doing something that they want to do. Now, of course, the other tensions are about land use tensions, and the ones I would mention are economic development, housing and green space, because that's all I have time for. I think Patrick Harvey and Sarah Boyd made good points about the way in which sustainable economic growth has replaced sustainable development, which is in the Act. Economic growth is also a stronger material consideration in the Scottish planning policy. So, yeah, obviously economic growth is important, so I'm not altogether with Patrick Harvey on that one, but there is a fear about economic growth crowding out other interests. So I am slightly nervous, along with Sarah Boyack and Patrick Harvey, on that particular one, and I'm not quite sure why we've had to change that language. I think there's a very strong statement about green space on page 39 of the Scottish planning policy, which I very much welcome, but sometimes interesting, there's a tension between housing and green space. I've got an example of that in my own constituency at present at City Park, which used to be the football ground of the Spartans Football Club, where, you know, it's hard for me to oppose a housing application because we need more housing, but there's all the land at the waterfront in my constituency as well, which could be used for housing, and yet we have a very highly valued piece of green space that looks as if it might disappear. So I think those words, which is really a presumption against developing open space on page 39, are important. But once again, we have that whole issue is how will we make sure local government actually follows Scottish planning policy, which leads back to the point, if there's no notification requirements, if there's no community right of notification, you know, how do you enforce the Scottish planning policy? Now, there's only 1 minute left, but I do want to mention Margaret Mitchell's amendment, because I do think enforcement is very important and is key to maintaining public confidence. And again, I've had another issue about enforcement in my constituency at Shrub Place, part of Leith Walk, recently, where actually one of the tram contractors was using it to dump all sorts of materials that were causing great distress to local residents, and they had no planning permission for it. But what is routine happened? They were asked to put in a planning application, but the work continued in the meantime. That concerns me. I think the public would feel far better if someone was doing something without planning permission, that they had to stop the work. You can put a stop notice on, I seem to remember, from 2006, but it never seems to happen. So enforcement is very important, and you know, I hope, well, I'm glad that the Minister has accepted that amendment. I was going to say something about unconventional gas extraction, but I see my 6 minutes are up, but I tend to agree with what Patrick Harvey said about that.
Many thanks. I now call on Claire Adamson to be followed by Nigel Donn. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very glad to be speaking in this debate this afternoon on the draft National Planning Framework and the draft Scottish Planning Policy. I grew up in Lanarkshire, and of course New Lanark is one of the most famous successes of placemaking not only in Scotland but possibly in the world. It was a vision of Robert Owen and included a factory, workers' housing, schools, a place of worship, shops which were at the forefront of the cooperative movement, and the very first workplace nursery in the world. Today, of course, it's acclaimed as a World Heritage Site, and Lanarkshire is proud of its heritage and New Lanark's place in our industrial history. However, I think everyone in the Chamber would recognise that it's highly unlikely that an enterprise such as this could get planning permission in Scotland today, as it was on an undeveloped and unspoilt site at the time. But it's right that that is so, because the National Planning Framework 3 should be giving us the balance of needs in our country. And I don't have a problem with the balanced growth statement that's in the document. I don't have a problem with balance at all, because if planning is about anything, it's about balancing our economic, our environmental needs and the future of our country. I very much welcome the themes in the policy document, which is focused on sustainable economic growth with more emphasis placed on economic benefits. The proposed planning system will support well-designed, successful, sustainable places where people want to live, want to visit and want to invest in. And our national planning policy and framework will support ambitions for a low-carbon economy, crucial for our country's future. And the planning system will support ambitions to respect, enhance and make responsible use of our natural and cultural assets. It should be a policy which will continue to be focused on sustainable economic growth, but with more emphasis placed on economic benefits. And this is key, and I don't have a problem with the wording in this. I think it's absolutely clear that what this planning document, both planning documents in draft form, give us is the opportunity to achieve the right balance for our country's future. There's also, the government mentions, a holistic approach to considering the relationship between buildings, natural resources, movement and utilities. And these are all key to getting that balance right. It should focus on positive placemaking, of which New Lanark, I suppose, is one of the most famous and most successful examples. But it's based on 6 qualities about how we develop that: distinctive, welcoming, adaptable, resource efficient, safe and pleasant, and easy to move around and beyond. That's why I very much look forward to the forthcoming policy on architecture and place, which will also show how we can encourage good design and create a kind of places we would all like to visit, live and work in. As a member for Central Scotland, I echo Margaret Mitchell's comments about what this will mean for Central Scotland as a region, and welcome the Grangemouth and Peterhead carbon capture and storage, the Central Scotland Green Network, the National Cycling Walking Network, which will cover all 3 local authorities in Central Scotland. But perhaps, if you don't mind, as someone who was born and brought up in Motherwell, if I do also focus on something that's been mentioned quite a bit this afternoon, and that's the Ravenscraig site. It's not the white canvas that Robert Owen had in New Lanark, but it's perhaps the nearest thing we have to that in Scotland. It's the biggest brownfield site in Europe, and that gives us great opportunity to get that balance right in our community. A balance that will meet the needs both of the existing towns of Motherwell and Wishaw, but also the economic opportunities and the development of Ravenscraig will give us. It's 30 years since Ravenscraig closed, and the initial plans for the site wanted a new town centre, major leisure facilities, housing, business industry, hotels, a railway station, as mentioned by Mr Pentland and his, that whole new town, community facilities and road improvements. It's a hugely ambitious project, but something that is desperately needed in Lanarkshire. And when we look to what industry might come back to Lanarkshire, I do hope that within Ravenscraig we'll be able to build on the history in our area of technology and engineering, and look to maybe building on some of the opportunities in the oil and gas sector and also new technologies when we look at what businesses might come to that area. Of course, it's not an empty site at the moment. We have Motherwell College, which has developed its
residential unit is a circle, which it alludes to the previous towers that existed in Ravenscraig. We also have the Regional Sports Centre, which has already been used for the International Children's Game and is a possible training centre for the 2014 Commonwealth Games. And again, the tradition there of the design to look like the steel coming off the end of the steel manufacturing process is captured in the design in Ravenscraig, and it's really interesting. But Sarah Boyack mentioned innovation, and I think the most exciting thing at Ravenscraig at the moment is the Building Research Establishment at the Innovation Park, which is going to build 6 sustainably and carbon efficient houses, and they're working very closely with the college to ensure that the skills that are there to build and use sustainable development, sustainable growth in our housing development will be met by the people in the area. So I do welcome this, and I think it's a great opportunity. I think if we get the balance right, it's wonderful for Scotland. And I would like to finish with a note of optimism from Robert Owen from 1816, where he says that he believes that no obstacle whatsoever interviewed at the moment except ignorance to prevent such a state of society from becoming universal. And I believe that's the case. We can achieve this.
Good. Thanks very much. Now call on Nigel Dawn, after which we'll move to closing speeches. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I say that I am coming 15th this afternoon, at which point I have to register that there may not be very much new to say. Now, I shall try and find something. I shall succeed as well, I can assure you. But I wouldn't want all the things that I've said before just to be gainsaid. I am entirely supportive of the documents we're seeing. I do want to congratulate the Government and the Minister on what he's achieved. But I do want to bring up perhaps half a dozen little issues where I think, well, let's just give it some thought. Can I first of all echo Sarah Boyack's comments about combined heat and power very early on? I don't think anybody else has picked that up in between. There is, of course, what is essentially an aircraft engine in Aberdeen attached to an alternator, and the heat that's generated as a result of that process it warms the adjacent tower blocks. Now, that's a standard bit of technology. It's been around my entire professional lifetime. And it's really the kind of thing we should be trying to put in all those areas where we have high density housing. We know where they are, okay? And I really do suggest to the Minister that that's something which we need to find ways of progressing. I know it's burning gas traditionally, but we're going to be burning quite a lot of gas for quite some time, and it's an extraordinarily efficient way of generating electricity and using what would otherwise be waste heat to deliver low-grade heat into buildings. It's entirely the right way forward thermodynamically, and it's something I would commend to the government. I'm also reflecting, and at this point I'm going to get rather nearer my own constituency, on the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route. And I would just like to pick up on, again, something which I don't think has been pointed out yet, that took, it seems, forever. And I just wonder whether the government has given any thoughts to the timetabling of that process, which I understand is through the courts, but it's not entirely out with this place's remit to consider how the courts actually deal with these things and whether something like that in the future could be allowed to take so long again. I do just wonder whether we need to address that, please. Could I also, and being distinctly more parochial here, take us to Montrose Harbour? That does appear in the documents, but register the thought that the throughput through Montrose Harbour is less than 1 million tonnes a year. And that does appear to be a cut-off point in this map, but it's also a significant, or there is a relevant cut-off point in terms of European funding. The Trans-European Transport Network generates funds, and I have here a document from John Patterson and Montrose Port Authority, who explains that with a threshold of 1.5 million tonnes cargo applies to funding from Europe, and this appears to be a completely arbitrary level, which means that a relatively small but actually quite substantial port like Montrose doesn't have access to funding, which is really quite important in the context of its development. And I do just wonder whether the government might like to give that some thought as well, please. I reflect on my days as a councillor in Dundee and on Mike Mackenzie's comment on planning resource. Now, I don't wish to criticise Dundee as such. I think we tried quite hard. But I am very conscious that as councillors, we were sometimes struggling to do things at a speed which our constituents really wanted us to because of resources. Now, The Minister has already mentioned this, and I know more money has gone into this. I think we really should be setting some quite serious targets and ensuring that they are met so that planning things are progressed on time. I'm sure the Minister has that in mind. I'm sure from his own local government experience that would be the case, but I would want to be assured that that really is going to work so that the planning process does not hold anybody up unnecessarily. I also would just like to confirm with the Minister, because I think what I heard him say about sustainable economic development, which has been the subject of much discussion, is that economic development is actually to be taken as a material consideration. And I think that is actually a fundamental point. But, and I come back to something that certainly Stuart McMullen pointed out and others have said, there needs to be community involvement in any planning application, because I think there are a lot of communities around the country who feel they've been told about economic development, there will be X hundred jobs. And then by the time you've finished, X hundred jobs have disappeared because some small part of the application has been forgotten about and perhaps the slightly more efficient bit has been left behind. So we do need to make sure that we play fair with communities in that process. Could I also consider long-distance cycling and walking routes? Again, they're in here. I'm looking at map 11. But reflecting that within my own constituency, much of that is on main roads. And I do think we should be trying to move to a position where you can go for a cycling holiday around Scotland without having to go anywhere near a main road on your bike. I recognise there will have to be bits that will be minor roads, and in some respects they can be equally dangerous to cyclists because you're not expecting to find them. But I do think we need to have a vision of that. I would like to see the ability to get off the train in Montrose, actually, as I will do later tonight, and take up the bike and cycle to Brecon, which is where I would like to stop, but then cycle up Glen Esk into the Cairngorm National Park. I think that ought to be perfectly possible. It wouldn't cost a fortune, and I commend that as a thought, again, to the Minister and to the Chamber. Lastly, could I reflect on town centres? I have 5 of them. I think I'm not the only one who's noticing that shops are closing in our towns. They don't have to be large. And some of those shops are never going to be reopening. That's quite simply because we're now shopping online. We use supermarkets. Supermarkets will deliver. And I know there is a fund which is being worked on to ensure that these purposes can be brought back into residential use. I'm sure that's a good thing, but I think that is something, again, that we need to work on, and we need to work on fairly quickly, because those shops are now there, they are now vacant, and they are not going to reopen as shops. So I'm sorry to give the Minister a few asks at the end.
And in drawing to a close.
But it is now my time to stop. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Harvey. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I first apologise to the Chair if some of my earlier language might have been unparliamentary. I have to admit I thought we had to go rather further than that to cross the line, but any offence was entirely unintentional. Grateful for your apology nonetheless. Thank you. I think I said in my opening speech that planning was sometimes not thought a particularly sexy subject, but I have to admit the planning nerd in me has got a bit of a kick out of this debate. I've enjoyed it very much. It's natural that there are things in these documents, as there were in the Minister's speech, which all members have been able to welcome, and I hope, again, that my amendment reflects that there are things to welcome from my perspective. The Central Scotland Green Network has been mentioned, sustainable and active travel has been mentioned, renewables and the electricity grid have been mentioned. And while many of us will always come to the Chamber and say that we want more or that we want a stronger focus on these things, I do want to put on record that there are aspects of these documents that I welcome and that I hope will be strengthened rather than downgraded in the final draft. But there are also areas, as I mentioned, which do seriously need to be questioned. I would like to question, for example, whether the Captain project, the coal gasification plant, whether it will be fully CCS compliant from day one of its operation, and whether it will be prevented from continuing to operate if the CCS technology doesn't achieve what it is set out to achieve. I do question the role that the Scottish Government sees for unconventional gas extraction, adding ever more to our stocks of fossil fuels. This is a threat, not an opportunity. And in transport terms, the emphasis continues to be on aviation expansion as well. And there's detail that's missing. I mentioned the issue around individual turbines, and I look forward to pursuing that with the Minister. Also, I would have
hope to hear something on the government's target for community-owned land and community-owned energy. A clearer emphasis within the planning system to achieve these things might have been helpful. I want to reflect on Sarah Boyack's contribution because I very much welcomed the thrust of it, the critique of sustainable economic growth. And I welcome Sarah Boyack to that argument very much. I've been doing just that since the government introduced the term to its government programme back in 2007, so I'd be very happy to share some of my best lines with Sarah if she's interested. I particularly enjoy describing it as the government's central contradiction, because the relentless pursuit of GDP growth is not only inherently unsustainable, it also fails to achieve economic justice, equality, or human well-being when it takes place in already wealthy societies. So I welcome also Sarah Boyack's comments on housing and energy, including heat, and I hope that the Minister will reflect on that argument before producing the final proposals for both documents. But it's understandable that from a Green perspective, many of the arguments I've involved myself in this debate have been on the issue of growth. And it's clear that in economic growth considerations will from now on trump environmental considerations. And I use the word quite consciously. Just as happened in the Many Estate scandal, when big money talks, it seems that the Scottish planning system will roll over. In my former colleagues from the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, Mike Mackenzie and Chick Brodie, took issue with the Green analysis of the question of growth. After calling for the government to use clearer language, Mr Brodie attempted to define sustainable economic growth, and after listening to his effort, I can only advise the Minister to look elsewhere for a plain English consultant. He suggested that before we can achieve social and environmental objectives, we need economic activity to generate wealth. No. No. Before we can sustain any kind of economy, before we can sustain any kind of economy, we must come to live within ecological limits. These are the limits the planet lays down. And before we can have a good society, we must challenge the selfish values of the current economic model. Kenny Gibson offered one definition from the OECD, I think, a definition of sustainable economic growth. I will read again the official report, the precise form of words that he used, but I'm pretty sure that the government doesn't report its own economic progress in line with that definition. The OECD, though, does offer a rather shorter one. Sustainable economic growth is that which sustains human and environmental as well as economic capital. Now, that's an interesting one, but it seems as though that definition is very little different from sustainable development. Now, if that's the case, I do question why sustainable development has been removed as the central objective in the planning system and replaced with growth. I do want to twist this argument round a bit, though, into something more positive, because the other NPF, the government's other NPF, the National Performance Framework, does have positive scope to move us beyond GDP, just as the government's advisor, Joseph Stiglitz, argues that the world should move beyond GDP. But that's why it's so troubling to see growth enshrined, not only in policy, but in law, as the government is doing in the Regulatory Reform Bill, before that debate on alternatives to GDP progresses. Deputy Presiding Officer, if the Green Party, of all people, didn't challenge this notion, then frankly, I'd wonder what it was for. Mine may be the only amendment tonight that isn't supported by the Chamber, and it may be that the Greens are the only people voting against the government motion tonight. But as a wise philosopher once said, it's not that easy being Green. Especially, though, at the end of a debate like this. I think it's the only colour I want to be.
Many thanks, and thank you for your contribution to the OED. I now call on Alex Johnston. 6 minutes, please, Mr Johnston.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by welcoming the publication of the two documents that we have before us today? And in fact, can I welcome much of what is contained within them? Because while there are, of course, points which I will disagree with, the broad thrust of what is contained within them does appeal to the Conservative side of this chamber. However, I would like to take issue with one or two speakers, the first one being Mike McKinsey, who said quite a bit about the use of plain English, which was in stark contrast, in my view, to the way the Minister opened the debate, which gave me the clear impression that in his office this morning they've been playing buzzword bingo, with the jargon, the planning speak, the cliché, the alliteration, and even the onomatopoeia was to the fore in great scale. However, through the mist, I could detect a number of issues in which I could find agreement. I and many other people during the course of this debate have, of course, talked about the commitment that's been given to town centres. Our town centres are a vital part of our country. In fact, Scotland can be defined by its smaller and medium-sized market towns, and if they are allowed to die, then the very heart of Scotland will disappear. However, I have to say that the most heartfelt plea for Scotland's town centres certainly came from Anne McTaggart, and during her contribution I got the clear indication that it is in fact the case that some shop to live, but others live to shop. Another area where I found an interesting discussion taking place was when the suggestion was made by the Minister himself that some people took the view that the NPF document was all about wind farms. Well, we all know that in fact it's just mostly about wind farms. The issue that was raised significantly by Patrick Harvey was the issue about where we choose to put wind farms. And I have to say that some of the language that the Minister brought forward today is the kind of language that we've been asking from successive planning ministers for years. However, I am not entirely convinced that this is a process that's going to deliver true strategic guidance on the timescale that many of us would like even now. Just as an aside, on the subject of whether a single wind turbine constitutes a wind farm, I'm no expert in that particular area, but I can look back in history of this Parliament and say that during the passage of the hunting bill, we received advice that one dog could in fact constitute a pack. I don't know if that can be carried over. On the issue of grid enhancement for our distribution of electricity, I think it is absolutely essential that we all back the principle of grid enhancement as a key element of what we try to do in the long term. We know it is not easy. The experience of the Beaulieu-Denny line and the planning process that had to go through will make it extremely difficult for us to progress grid enhancement as quickly as we would all like. And while there are those of us who are concerned about the massive spread in wind farms, it is of course the case that if we are to develop environmentally based electricity sources in the long term, Scotland's grid must be enhanced. And for that reason, we look forward to rising to that challenge too. An interesting point in the debate was where Sarah Boyack seemed to suggest that we're still in a recession. I don't believe Scotland is in a recession. I believe we're doing extremely well. In fact, the figures for employment that were announced earlier on today indicate that Scotland is doing rather better from the far-sighted and ambitious policies of George Osborne than even the rest of the United Kingdom is. I would, however, suggest that this advantage may be accrued from the fact that we here in Scotland were freed from the dead hand of Labour control a full 3 years before the UK was, and consequently we have a head start. If I could move on briefly to an area which is perhaps critical of the government. Margaret Mitchell spoke at some length about the issues of enforcement that surround planning. And I would be amiss if I did not raise the issue that I've raised before on this subject, and that is timescales. The efficient planning system that we have, the efficiency of the planning system in Scotland is vital to our economic well-being. We all know that planning applications can be contentious and even divisive within communities. But the situation we find ourselves in today is that planning applications, particularly major planning applications, are taking longer and longer. Anything deemed as a major development in Q3 of 2012-13, which is the most recent figures I have, was taking 36 weeks. And individual times range from 8 right through to an astonishing 84 weeks. That's 84 weeks of frustration and delay that brings with it the continuing risk of another local economy might miss out on investment. Processing times, including legal agreements, make further grim reading with an average of 103 weeks. That's almost 2 years to process an application, and I don't think that's fair on investors or communities which may be opposing these developments. As I bring my remarks to a conclusion, it has to be said that I would like to say more about unconventional gas. I believe that contained within these documents, it is described as an opportunity. I believe it's an opportunity we must explore in order to create the jobs and wealth that gas production can bring, as well as the opportunity to cut energy costs. So with that said, I will bring my remarks to a conclusion by saying that at 5 o'clock tonight, Minister, you will have the support of the Conservatives, whether you like it or not.
Thank you very much. Now, Sarah Boyer, 8 minutes, please.
Yes, well, delighted to follow that. My point was in the context of housing, and it isn't a serious point because even though there are new jobs being created as we speak, the housing market has not turned round. The social housing investment process is broken, as was said to me at a recent council briefing, and the problem is that there is aspiration across the country with land that has been cleared for planning, land that's got planning permission, but the developers cannot afford to put houses onto those plots. So there is a key problem, and it's a huge issue in Edinburgh, and I maybe want to start on this because the Minister will be aware about this. The issue of having 5-year land supply that is viable, that is capable of being development and that is marketable, actually is a really difficult issue at the moment. Now, on paper, that looks like a totally sensible thing, but in Edinburgh, for example, the local plan is about to be delivered, where planners thought, or where the council thought that they were about to get thousands of houses from the waterfront, as Malcolm Chisholm mentioned. They're now seeing a massive shortfall on that site, and that site's not going to be easily met anywhere else in the city. It's certainly not going to be met instantly. And as I understand it, the local planning authority is going to be asked to increase dramatically the amount of land that's going to be available. But the developers say they can only build just over 5,000 houses in the next 5 years, although there's land for nearly 42,000 houses. So there's a gap between planning that is identified for development, planning that's got land that's got planning clearance, but there simply isn't the money to develop it. And as I understand it in Edinburgh's case, we could potentially end up with a free-for-all with sites that you could call them brownfield, you could call them sites that have formerly been developed, you could describe them as gap sites. Those sites will not be as attractive as greenbelt land, and I think it's an issue that the Minister really needs to have a very sharp look at. We need to make sure there isn't a free-for-all, and we need to get ourselves from a position where there's land available for development, there's land identified for development, but the developers can't make it work at the moment. And that goes to the heart of issues about both private and public sector investment. And I do think that what's happened with the Scottish Government's investment in housing is not helping those issues. So there's a real issue. I hope the Minister will agree to have a meeting with me. This issue was raised by the City Council in their quarterly planning briefing. It came up in a discussion we had with a number of local authorities around Edinburgh, because other local authorities don't want to take up Edinburgh's slack in terms of housing. So it becomes a regional issue, but at the end nobody's going to win, because the land won't become available for development. We won't get the housing growth we need, we won't get the industry development we need, and we won't get the houses that we need. And planning is being seen as the problem rather than the solution. And I think that's really one of the issues about this debate. Planning cannot be the obstruction to development, but it has to be about how we get the right kind of development and about how we get a positive process for shaping our communities for future development. And if you add together what we were all saying, that really is it. It's about all of our aspirations for development. And I think there's a particular requirement for all of us in here to make sure that our communities understand that there is a national planning framework, and that once those priorities have been agreed by the government, and once it's gone through the parliamentary process, those projects will be effectively approved. So it is a major issue for our constituents, and although there has been some innovative work, I'm not sure that all our constituents who live in those areas will actually be aware of it. So there is a challenge in that regard. I think there's an issue that I wanted to focus on in the end, and that is about the tools for the job, and that is about who's actually carrying out this planning, because quite a number of colleagues have talked about the need to have faster planning, the need to have faster decision making. And there is a real tension here. There is an issue, and Malcolm Chisholm referred to it. To have a much more of an upfront investment in planning consultation is obviously correct, but you still need to get the applications coming in that do meet communities' demands and that do meet the demands of the planning system and the development industry. And reconciling those demands when they are different is the job of planning. And one of the things I think we need to highlight is that although the Minister is asking planning authorities to move faster, to move swifter, they're doing it with less planners. And they're doing it with less people in other departments in the Council to support those planners. And a recent survey done by Unison that came out only today, when surveying planning staff, talked about the reduction in the number of planners that are actually in our local authorities. And 60% of the planners who were interviewed described the level of cuts as major or severe. 53% believed that there were further major or severe cuts to come. And 87% of those planners believed that the overall service provided to the public is being adversely affected. So there are major challenges here in terms of delivering the kind of planning system that we want. A planning system that is responsive, that is swift, but yet deals with ever more complexity. And if you look through what's in this, the Scottish Planning Policy document, there are major challenges in terms of delivering on all these objectives. If we're looking at having the right kind of infrastructure development in terms of energy, or in terms of digital infrastructure, or transport infrastructure, or looking at CO2 emissions, that actually requires a process whereby applications are tested against all of those things, and that is not always just going to be a tick-the-box exercise. It has to be a proper evaluation and a proper judgment. And the bit at the end that Malcolm Chisholm talked about also needs to be right, because there will be occasions where the Scottish Government does need to actually look at some of the decisions that are being rubber-stamped at a local level. So there is a need that we get this right, and it comes back to the issue of what is the purpose of planning. And I want to come back to my opening remarks about sustainable development should be our starting point, and economic growth has to be part of that process. And we are in difficult economic times, whether we're in a recession or whether we're in difficult economic times, I don't really care. The point is there are still thousands upon thousands of young people not getting jobs. There are young people that have got their 5 standard grades who would historically never have got those standard grades, and they're now coming onto a labour market where there aren't jobs. So we have to take economic issues into account, but they cannot, as I said in my opening remarks, trump everything else. And if you look at how SPP is actually set out, it starts off with sustainable economic growth and then it goes to sustainable development, and it should be the other way around. And that's why climate change has to be factored in as part of that process. I'll take a brief intervention. I think I've got 8 minutes, Presiding Officer.
Yes, Patrick Harvey, you are in your last minute.
I'm grateful to the member. Short-term considerations may be different, but we're passing policy here which will last for the long term, even after the recession ends. Isn't there a danger that growth then becomes a priority when it needn't be?
45 seconds,
No, my point is actually, regardless of whether it's in the good times or the tough times, the decisions need to be right because they will be with us for the long term. And we do need to be creating jobs, we do need to be supporting industry, but we just need to be doing it from the basis of thinking through the impact of it. And that's why you don't start off with sustainable economic growth, which can't be defined properly. Sustainable development is in legislation at an international level, at a European level, and at a UK and a Scottish level. That should be our starting point. It's not about being against development, it's about being in favour of the right development and making sure that we get it right for future generations. And that has to be what the planning system is about. It is about the long term as well as the short term. And when planning gets it right, it does deliver exciting things like national parks, the West Highland Way, cleaning up the legacy of industrial sites in Falkirk or Stirling. Planning, when it's given the right resource, can deliver a huge amount, but it needs the right objectives. And this Scottish Planning Policy document is the place to get that framework right. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Minister Derek Mackay to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 4:59. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a very good debate around National Planning Framework 3 and Scottish Planning Policy. And I would like to begin by following on from what Sarah Boyack has said, to say that I agree that planning decisions are for the short, medium and the long term. And we shouldn't be making decisions that only affect the short term and don't consider the long term. And that's why I think that the aspirations set out, particularly in MPF 3, about a transition to a low-carbon economy, an area in which people want to invest, about connectivity and quality places, I think is so important. And I do believe there's a strong sense of sustainability and sustainable development within that. And we've spoken about the economic cycle. Clearly, it would be beyond frustration to have a system that doesn't enable sustainable economic growth at this time, to ensure that we are building those quality places. And I think all the contributions, even though the fully expected comments from the Greens help within that debate. So let me be clear, sustainable development's importance has not changed in these policy documents. Where the shift is a greater understanding of economic impact in terms of the weighting and the understanding within the planning process. Because I find it frankly bizarre that some applications and some decisions haven't featured the economic impact when it comes to the determination. So imagine the great news today that there's more money for wage support schemes for youth unemployment, to get young folk back into work, and then to be told that it will take 2 years to process the planning application to realise that economic impact on the ground. So the planning system should be enabling the right development in the right places. And the reason I use the word balance, to come to Patrick Harvey, and I think it took 3 interventions, I do believe there is a balance between the economic impact and the environmental issues. And I think I've said very clearly that development is not necessarily at the expense of the environment, but in fact, to realise our aspirations around the low-carbon economy, the investment proposals and the planning proposals in this will help us do that, around, say, housing, transport, decarbonisation, and particularly around energy. And I welcome the support in the renewables policy, which has various new proposed categories to assist and give the clarity that Jim Hume was looking for in terms of planning support for local authorities, but still empowering them to find the right sites, the most appropriate sites within the national parameters. Now, a couple of technical questions were raised, for example, around the Town Centres External Advisory Group report. To answer Margaret Mitchell's question, it will report imminently. We're waiting on the External Advisory Group to conclude the report before the Government, of course, responds. It's my understanding that we're a few weeks away from that, maybe even shorter than that. We're waiting on that report to be concluded. But therein lies an opportunity within planning to extend a sequential approach. Sorry, Mr Johnston, that I have to turn to that, but we have to expand the sequential approach to ensure that the town centres give protection to more than just retail. Town centres will change from their traditional patterns and have new functions. There will have to be some diversification, repopulation and so on. So the planning guidance around town centres, I think, will be strengthened. There's been far more engagement in MPF 3 than there has been in earlier iterations, MPF 2 or the original planning framework, and I think that's to be welcomed. This debate, for example, is informing the policies as they go forward. And I have been out personally to meet the public on some of these priorities, but there is an expectation that local planning priorities and local planning designations are consulted upon, and that includes through the Community Council liaison officers. In terms of further opportunities, yes, we're considering other sources of energy, but the environmental concerns and assessments must be taken into account. It's not seen as an opportunity in isolation, but consider the environmental issues therein, and the opportunity with heat maps to more adequately connect heat source with provision and demand in a way that hasn't been mapped out before. And on connections, both transport connections, in terms of the various networks to connect Scotland, to enhance the opportunities, including for offshore renewables as well. And some have said in relation to renewables that the greater protection for the environment afforded by these new policies will mean an over-concentration in the areas without that greater protection. That's not necessarily the case, that there will be that proliferation, because with repowering, with the offshore opportunities and with the changes in technology, one does not necessarily lead to the other, and we can meet the renewables targets without some of the scare stories and the fears around how it might proliferate, because we're also consulting at the same time on cumulative impact and on the separation distances and extending them from existing communities. But there's further opportunities in technology, such as digital technology and permitted development there that I spoke about at the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, that have considered some of these issues in detail. On green infrastructure, there are fantastic opportunities connecting urban and rural communities, and the opportunities there, connecting ecosystems with economics. And I think that's why the Central Scotland Green Network is such a welcome ongoing project within the proposed developments. And of the 14, I suppose it is coincidence that we had 14 priorities before and 14 continuing. Some haven't continued because they've been complete, they've reached their consenting regime, or are no longer appropriate, such as Kenny Gibson explained in relation to Hunterston, or the Commonwealth Games, which indeed will be concluded by the time we get to the implementation of MPF3 in June 2014. But I think the particularly strong candidate national sites that have featured have been welcomed in this debate this afternoon. I didn't hear much dissension from those that are proposed to go forward. And that includes, for example, Ravenscraig, that I do see, and some members have recognised as an opportunity, not a threat to surrounding communities, although I understand Mr Wilson's concerns, but an opportunity here to regenerate a part of Scotland that so desperately needs it, not just housing, but educational, town centre, connectivity and the innovation that's going on there as well. And the grid infrastructure enhancements to achieve our renewables and our energy capacity issues, the wonderful opportunities there, of course.
Would you like to update the Parliament in terms of progress in building that infrastructural grid? I understand that there are some significant delays currently in the system.
Minister Derek Mackay.
Clearly, I can't prejudice individual planning decisions, but what this framework does is create the planning hierarchy that gives certainty for investors and for planners in terms of what infrastructure is important to meet our ambitions as a nation. And that, in essence, is what these documents are all about. Other new features will include Dundee Waterfront, the connection there between the waterfront and the city, the regeneration at Ravenscraig we've touched upon, Aberdeen Harbour, the fact that we're reaching capacity there and there's room for expansion to enhance the economic vibrancy of the area, the Grangemouth investment zone, the connections from high-speed rail and the strategic airport enhancements, which are so vital for using airports as part of the dynamism and the dynamic places in which we do business, connect to the world and realise our local economic growth plans. Now, performance is clearly an issue within the planning system, and that's why we've focused very much as a government on the 4 pillars of planning reform in terms of a plan-led system, focusing on the plan, simplification and streamlining, taking out of the system that which adds no value. Improved performance has meant, to turn to Nigel Don's point about resources, an increase in planning fees should encourage better investment in the planning system, which I believe will make a difference in delivery on the ground to improve the timescales. That has been touched upon. Brownfield sites and regeneration, there's no dilution of the policy there. Actually, we've strengthened it. We don't use the term brownfield sites, but we've used previously developed land. But like with so many other issues in this consultation, if people feel there are gaps or amendments required, then of course we will look at that language to make sure there's not even the perception of a shift against in terms of that particular policy. But we're very focused on the climate change agenda, moving on that, using the planning system to achieve our most ambitious climate change targets in the world, to focus on architecture, placemaking, quality, the environment, but to realise the aspirations of our country in a way that is engaging with the public. And of course, in enforcement, the system is only as good as the enforcement powers that we're willing to use, although that is more a matter for local government, but one, by accepting the amendment, we will take very seriously indeed. So this is about balance. We argue over definitions, and Chick Brodie made the comment around language and planning, but I actually think they're very clear, concise and positive and dynamic documents, but I think ones that will set the vision for Scotland and provide the platform in which we can inject energy into other government strategies to ensure that we can continue the road to recovery in Scotland, increasing employment, sustainable economic growth, protecting the environment, achieving our targets, including renewables, and design the kind of country in which we all want to live, work and invest. And I will do my part as the Planning Minister to make sure the system contributes to that in a very positive way. Thank you.
Many thanks. And that concludes the debate on progress towards National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 6943 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I now call on Minister Joe Fitzpatrick to move the motion number 6943.
Formally moved.
Thank you. And as no member has asked to speak against the motion, I will now put the question to the Chamber. And the question is that motion number 6943 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The next item of business is consideration of 8 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion numbers 6945 to 6951 on approval of SSIs en bloc. Minister?
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. I will now also ask the Minister Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6944 on the establishment of a committee. Minister?
Moved.
Thank you. And these questions on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. And there are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And the first question is that Amendment 6933.3 in the name of Sarah Boyett, which seeks to amend motion number 6933 in the name of Derek Mackay on progress towards National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that Amendment 6933.1 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, which seeks to amend motion number 6933 in the name of Derek Mackay on progress towards National Planning Framework 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that Amendment 6933.2 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend motion number 6933 in the name of Derek Mackay on progress towards NPF 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will therefore be a division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6933.2 in the name of Patrick Harvey is yes 5, no 91. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion number 6933 in the name of Derek Mackay as amended in progress towards NPF 3 and the Scottish Planning Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will therefore be a division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on motion number 6933 in the name of Derek Mackay as amended is yes 94, no 2. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. I now propose to put a single question on motion number 6945 to 6951 on approval of SSIs. If any member objects to a single question being put, please say so now. As no one has objected, I will now ask the question that motion numbers 6945 to 6951 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of SSIs be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The final question is that motion number 6944 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the establishment of a committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. So that concludes decision time, and we'll now move on to members' business. Thank you.